Okay, so it's the sweltering heat of July 1944. Soviet troops have broken the momentum and are advancing towards Nazi Germany. 80 years later, it would be a popular myth abroad that those troops were Russian troops. In reality, most were non-ethnic Russians, like a Crimea Tatar soldier Ashraf Moinov, who's penning a letter home from the front line. He's angry and frustrated because it has been weeks since the last time anyone replied to him. I mean, really, being that deep in the rear, don't you have the opportunity to write and send letters and this way raise the spirits and mood of the frontline soldiers? If I don't receive any letters from you, I won't write anymore. Ashraf has no idea that his family, brothers and sisters are no longer there to receive his letters or reply. A bewildering void where once was a lively correspondence full of love and care. At last, he receives a letter from a brother, informing him that overnight the entire village left from Crimea, Qirim to Central Asia, but he has zero idea where their sisters are. Ashraf is confused. You all left Crimea together, so how did they end up not being with you? Hi Ali, I ask you to find Uriya and let me know. Tell her that I am alive and well and that I will come after the war is over. I don't count on this, it's war. But if I die for the liberation of our homeland from the German invaders. And where's your property? Who did you leave it to? Ashraf doesn't know that his family wouldn't care about the property anymore. They lived in barracks behind barbed wire, and anyone who tried to leave would be shot. All the while, they had to perform slave labor in the middle of Uzbekistan. He probably never found out what had happened. At last, Ashraf receives a letter from his sister, Uriya. It is confusing and lacks details, but one thing is clear, she pleads for help. Ashraf writes to brother, "Hello brother Hayali, today I got a letter from Uriya. Uriya's situation is very sad, she needs your help." There was one more letter by Ashraf Moinov. It was in Qirim, not Russian this time, written in the Latin alphabet, probably to avoid military censorship. In it, his tone was different. He demanded from his brother answers. How could it be possible? Why aren't they in Qirim? For how long? What happened? It was the last letter. Ashraf Moinov vanished soon after, his fate forever unknown. The story of Ashraf's family is a mere fragment of the Surgunlik, the forced 1944 deportation of the entire nation of Qirim, Crimean indigenous people. Orchestrated by Moscow, it resulted in the genocide and murder of almost every second Qirim person. This tragedy is just one of many acts of colonial violence that Russians committed in Qirim. The Ukrainian peninsula is one of the most brutal examples of settler colonialism in human history. But this is not an association that most of you foreigners have with Crimea. Most of you do not even know the region by its authentic name, Qirim. So why is that? You'll understand better after we share with you one of the darkest secrets hidden within the walls of Western academia. Hey there, I'm Maksym Eristavi, a Ukrainian journalist and author of the award-winning Russian Colonialism 101 guidebook. In this episode, we tackle Russian infiltration of Western academia and how it helped to keep Russian colonialism hidden in plain sight. This is Matryoshka of Lies, the Infiltration episode. During one of the May nights in 1944, Russians gave tens of thousands of Crimean families 15 minutes to gather all their belongings before being deported for good. These were mostly women, kids, and elderly, since most men were fighting Nazi Germany on the front line. Russian colonial authorities seized this moment of vulnerability of a nation that consistently resisted Moscow since their lands were occupied by Russians in the late 18th century. After the final solution was executed, Moscow erased every reminder of the Qirim indigenous people. Every geographical name, every street name, and their homes were given to Russian settler colonists. But it's not just an old history chapter. This erasure has allowed Russia to maximize this Crimea is Russian myth and justify the ongoing invasion of Ukraine.
As I argue in my book, Blood of Others, until recently, I think we tended to read politics and society in Crimea, for instance, after 1991, according to a very dry, scholarly, regional interethnic paradigm, one that was consumed by a negotiation of interests with Ukrainians, Russians, and Crimean Tatars all kind of jostling for position and for power. But we should have been studying this dynamic according to a decolonization paradigm. That is, one that was concerned with transitional justice and intergroup reconciliation. So we should have been studying it according to a framework that accounted for the structural echoes of empire and the colonial system.
Rory Finnin is a professor of Ukrainian studies at the University of Cambridge.
But we didn't, and as a result, we failed to make historical parallels and to learn from other cases of settler colonialism around the globe, from the United States to Australia. And imagine if we had, because when it came to politics in Crimea, we could have advocated and pushed for the use of tested mechanisms of restorative policy. So policies like official apology, truth commissions, electoral quotas.
Despite Crimea Qirim being central to Russian imperial mythology, Professor Finnin is the only prominent Western thinker who studies the region through the stories and perspectives of its indigenous people. He speaks the Kremlin language and works with authentic sources, not just with Russian translations and interpretations as most of his colleagues do. Professor Finnin says we have a huge problem with how badly Russia is explained abroad by leading thinkers, and this problem takes its roots in Western classes and lecture halls.
Today, some analysts have even projected and imagined that the Russian Federation could collapse over the years ahead and fragment along the lines of its 21 different republics. But how many of us are actually studying these republics closely? The largest republic in the Russian Federation is Sakha, or Yakutia, but how many understand that the territory of Sakha is roughly the size of India? It should be shocking for us to realize that in the West, we maybe have a handful of people who study Sakha on its own terms, a place that, if ever independent, would be the 8th largest country in the world. But it also reveals an important truth that scholars in the West have been slow to acknowledge for a very long time, an unacceptably long time.
What if I tell you that this deficit of perspectives from the nations Russia abused is not random?
Scholars of Ukraine who were of Ukrainian background were treated with automatic suspicion and were accused of being not objective, accused of being quote-unquote rabid nationalists, and so on and so forth. So their work was being discounted as something that does not have equal value to the work of colleagues of non-Ukrainian background if they work on Ukraine.
This is Dr. Vitaly Chernetsky. He is the current president of the Association of Slavic, East European and Eurasian Studies, the first Ukrainian elected to this position in 76-year-old history of this central academic institution that shapes the Western outlook on Russia and its neighbors. So why did it take it so long?
Basically, this was how the situation was. Russian studying Russia was still in the views of those academic audiences capable of producing objective and unbiased scholarship. But this expectation, or that the scholarship will be unbiased, was somehow denied to scholars of Ukraine who are of Ukrainian background.
It is striking, isn't it? In one room, you have two scholars. One considered objective and professional, the other viewed with suspicion and bias due to their background. This power imbalance is often overlooked.
I saw that in the 90s, in the context now after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the serious engagement with the West, I maintained contacts with colleagues in both Ukraine and Russia, and I saw the colleagues in Russia, even the most progressive ones, just make fun of the post-colonial theories.
This was back in the late 90s when Dr. Chernetsky was a young scholar from Ukraine just entering the halls of Western universities. He was one of the first there to publish studies on Russian colonialism in Ukraine, but they received mostly pushback.
The entire discourse to them was silly, frivolous, and worthy of engaging with. And the context of the non-Russian intellectual labor and knowledge production was just ignored altogether. It was the continuation of those old traditions where anything of importance happens in Moscow, well, maybe also in Leningrad, St. Petersburg, and everything that is beyond, the Moscow Beltway, the Moscow Ring Road is just sad, gray, uninteresting provinces where nothing of value can ever come from.
So for generations, Russia and its neighbors have been studied abroad exclusively through the lenses of the metropole. Only Russian scholars could be considered as voices of ultimate, unbiased authority. That's how Russian imperial myths, such as brotherly nations or Russia as a benevolent civilizer and anti-colonial champion, infiltrated and corrupted the public perception of Moscow abroad. But Russia is not the only one to blame.
My beloved father, I feel well so far. We are about 11 kilometers from one position and 5 or 7 from another. The enemy is still far away and our troops hit very hard. They are very excited. Send us a few hazelnuts and, if possible, some sweets. Take care of yourself. Kiss you a lot. By the way, it is not cold here. Give my regard to all. Do not be afraid. We will celebrate a glorious victory.
This is a diary note by Matryoshka. Today she's a national hero in Georgia, or self-named Sakartvelo, a small Eastern European state and former Russian colony. A 20-year-old army nurse bravely resisted the Russian invasion of 1921, but was murdered by Russian troops. Maro was part of a uniquely visionary European generation that in 1918 founded one of the most progressive socialist democracies in the world, a democracy that allowed women to vote and had many female members of parliament, a democracy that protected the rights of minorities and made labor rights sacral. Maro witnessed and documented it in her diaries. At the same time, neighboring Russia was also trying to convince the world that it was building the first communist utopia. But Moscow continued colonial business as usual behind this PR facade. For example, invading Sakartvelo, drowning its daring socialist experiment in rivers of blood, and annihilating the country's intellectual and political elites.
The sentiments Makashvili described in her diaries during this time talk of freedom for women and her whole country. These are ideas that resonate today with those living in the trenches of the long war against Russian imperialism. Ukraine is its current and bloodiest epicenter, but its front line stretches across Russia's vast former empire. You wouldn't know it, though, listening to mainstream media in the West that explain the war through the prism of a geopolitical struggle between Moscow and Washington, and inadvertently diminish the actual struggle of people on the front lines.
This is Natalia Antelava, a prominent Georgian journalist and founder of newsroom Coda Story. She also runs a storytelling festival, Zekfest, that became one of the decolonization hotspots of Eastern Europe in the last 2 years.
This happens, in part at least, because we have a very narrow definition of what colonialism is, but also because of Russia weaponizing disinformation. In 2022, while dropping bombs on Kyiv, Vladimir Putin launched an audaciously counterintuitive campaign that positioned him as the global anti-colonial hero. Piggybacking on the Soviet legacy of support for anti-colonial movements and banking on people's genuine disillusionment with the double standards of American foreign policy in places like the Middle East, Putin ordered his diplomats in Africa, Latin America, and Asia to double down on the anti-colonial message. Using social media, the Russian propaganda machine beamed the same messages, targeting news feeds of left-leaning audiences in the West, as well as immigrant and Black communities in the United States. And it worked.
So Georgia's socialist experiment of the 1920s, or, for example, trailblazing social democratic vision of independent Ukraine in 1918, are unfortunately virtually unknown abroad. But many in Western intellectual circles can quote Lenin and speak at length, romanticizing Russia's communist past, despite that it was nothing more than a facade of Russian imperialism. Why being so obsessed with Russian version of history?
A lot of people, for reasons I have trouble understanding fully, to be honest, grasped upon the Soviet Union as the last good country that existed, as they commonly refer to it, actually existing socially. And I'm not just talking about fringe anonymous commenters on Twitter, talking about journalists and academics who publish papers that exonerate or apologize for Stalin or whatever. These people still exist. They still have a shocking amount of influence in Western institutions, God knows why, or they stick to incredibly discredited World War II era tropes about the Soviet Union. And as a result, Ukrainians who are, and it's not just Ukrainians who have this, it's everyone, but we're the ones in the kind of international spotlight right now. When you present a Ukrainian and goes, hey, actually, guys, no, the USSR was shit. It was a horrible place. Everyone was constantly poor. You couldn't say anything. People would just disappear sometimes, and that was normal and accepted. People got arrested and died, thousands of miles away in prison because their manager wanted to free up money to hire their, son-in-law or whatever. Just horrible. It was just a dystopia in every single sense.
This is Romeo Kokriatski, a Ukrainian journalist and managing editor at the leading newsroom New Voice Ukraine.
But when you have a person that goes, hey guys, actually, that mythical fantasy land that you've thought, no, it's a real place and it sucks, well, you're not attacking the real place because these people don't know what the real USSR was. You're attacking the fantasy. And when you attack people's fantasies, they get really, really defensive. No one wants to be told that their fantasies are not just wrong or misinformed, but flat out evil. Because, I'm sorry, apologia for a totalitarian state is evil. There's no other word for it.
Kokriatski doesn't think that the denial of Western intellectual circles when it comes to Russian imperialism and colonialism, especially the progressive and leftist side of it, is random. It has everything to do with entrenched culture of looking at the rest of the world through the prism of Western concerns, Western experiences and Western culture, intellectual narcissism of some sort, and a very colonial outlook on its own.
So as a result, when the simple fact of your existence violates this very deep-set fantasy because you need something to counterbalance the awfulness and evilness of the US constantly. And when it turns out what you've chosen is actually just, if not more evil than the US, and you have no moral ground, well, you would be unmoored. You'd have an identity crisis. So you have to deny the very existence of these people. You have to deny their identity as a separate people entirely. You have to deny all of their experiences, all of their history, everything. And that's the fundamental thing. We aren't real. Ukrainians aren't real. You put a Ukrainian in front of the people that stopped the war conferences in London, or one of those other fake anti-war protests, and they cannot handle it. They can only rationalize us sharing our stories by calling us all Nazis. Because if there is even a hint of truth in what we're saying, their entire imagined moral system comes tumbling down.
So, any good antidote to all of this? Dr. Rory Finnin of Cambridge, once again.
First of all, the most powerful tool to encourage a critical assessment of Russia and its colonial legacy is the tool we can pick up and use right now. It is to study the histories, languages, and cultures of the peoples that Russia has colonized in various ways. Colonized geographically, physically, cognitively. So Ukrainians, Crimean Tatars, Circassians, Kazakhs, the list goes on and on.
So if the realization that Russia is an expansionist land empire that had pursued brutal genocidal projects of settler colonialism throughout its history all the way to the present day is a big surprise to you, it only means that you also fell victim to the Russian ideological infiltration. Infiltration that ensured we're blind to the systemic abuse unfolding in front of our eyes. Infiltration that obscured the difference between the aggressor and the victim and prevented the victim from speaking out. Infiltration that made us too comfortable with not critically examining our beliefs. But don't worry, if you're listening to this show, you're already on the right track with us. to put that infiltration to an end. This show is written by Yev Kopika, produced by Alina Polyakova, mixed and sound directed by Anastasia Fedoskina, co-produced and narrated by me, Maksym Eristavi. Support the journalism of Ukrainska Pravda. Learn how at pravda.com.ua. Ukrainian voices and media face lots of censoring and gatekeeping, both online and offline, so please rate and leave comments under this podcast, wherever you listen to it. It will really help us to break through the filters to the widest audience possible. The empire will fall.